Hi, welcome to another language diversity video. This is the third one that we've done, and this one is about the work of sociolinguists, Peter Trudgill, the Milroys, and Jenny Cheshire. So let's get started on this. Now, Peter Trudgill is one of the earliest sort of British sociolinguists who goes and collects kind of systematic scientific evidence about the relationship between language and class, social class. And he does a lot of research in the 1970s in Norwich. And what he's particularly interested in is phonology. So he's interested in particular phonological variables and what they may indicate about somebody's social class. Here's quite a famous study that he did where he was looking at the velar nasal sound. Now, the velar nasal sound is that NG sound when you're forming the progressive aspect of a verb, like drinking, for example. So that ing in RP, ing. And he was noticing that people in the town, as across many towns across the whole of the UK, were saying drink in rather than drinking, or walk in rather than walking. So he did a systematic study of this. And as you can see, he came up with very clear patterns. On the left-hand side there of your graph, you've got the middle classes, very, very few of whom are pronouncing walking as walkin or drinking as drinking. So virtually all of them are pronouncing it as a velar nasal sound. And as you go through or down the sort of the spectrum, and you get further down into the lower working classes, you can see that almost 100% of the people that he interviewed were pronouncing walk-in that way and not using the velar nasal sound. So this was quite an interesting study that showed a very close linkage between somebody's social class and this accent form that they were using. The other thing that you need to look at here is the difference between the two different colours. Because he noticed gender differences, and across all the different social classes, what he noticed that was a slight variation between males and females, that males tended to use the more kind of non-standard forms, or rather the non-RP forms, rather than the females. So in all classes, females tended to use the more prestigious form. Okay, so in summary, these are his sorts of conclusions. In all social classes, the more careful the speech, the more likely people were to say walking rather than walk-in. Secondly, the proportion of walk-in type forms was higher in lower social classes. Thirdly, the non-standard n forms occurred more often in men's speech than in women's, and this was true across all of social classes. This is an interesting finding that when women were questioned about what they thought they were saying, they tended to say that they used the standard ing form more often than they really did. Okay. And conversely, when men were questioned about what they thought they were saying, they tended to say that they used the walk-in form more often than they really did. So there's some quite interesting research there done about male and female perceptions about their own speech. So overall, these findings suggest that this use of the phonological variable ng, the velar nasal, in Norwich in the 1970s was perhaps affected by people's social class, their gender, and the social context. So there's one interesting piece of research. Trudgill also did some research about grammar as well. It wasn't just about phonology. Here's just a reminder of where we are in Norwich. So we're taking a train from London, we're going through Cambridgeshire, and there is Norwich in East Anglia. And on this one, in terms of grammar, he's focusing on the S inflection in the third person singular present simple form. So he sings, she dances. So those are the standard forms. And if you were saying that in a non-standard way, you'd say something like he sing or she dance. So what Trudgill found was that social class actually directly affects usage. And he found that 97% of lower class participants omitted that S inflection. So they were saying things like he sing. And of your lower middle class participants, 29% of them omitted that S. And then the middle classes, not one single participant actually omitted the S. They all said it in a standard way. So again, very close correlation between somebody's social class and somebody's language features, according to Trudgill's 1970s Norwich study. You always have to remember that these are old studies, these are nearly 50 years old. They are in a particular part of the country, and therefore, when you're writing about these things in the exam, you always need to draw attention to the age of them. Okay, let's move on to another sociolinguistic study. We're moving forward through time. We're in the 1980s now, the early 1980s, and we've got a sociolinguist called Jenny Cheshire. This is Jenny Cheshire. She did her research in Reading, in Berkshire, and she was interested in the language of teenagers, and particularly what their language showed about group membership. And she focused in on the extent to which they were using non-standard forms. The non-standard forms are actually in your AQA textbook, that's this one, on page 176. So there's 3 examples there. You've got the non-standard S inflection, which we've just talked about with Peter Trudgill. You've got multiple negation, like he never done nothing. You've got use of ain't. And there are other ones there on page 176, like, for example, non-standard was, as in you was telling me, or non-standard what. Are you the boys what hit them? Like that. So you get your full list there. What she concluded was that basically teenagers were using language to conform to gang subculture, and that essentially those participants who identified themselves as kind of gang members tended to use more non-standard forms. And she also concluded about gender that boys in her study tended to use much more non-standard forms than girls. And her conclusion from that is that boys perceived that they got some kind of status, some kind of covert prestige from using these vernacular forms. So just like we were saying on the previous video about the William Labov study relating to Howard Giles's accommodation theory, you could argue that this also relates to that people signal social identity and group membership through, in this case, non-standard forms. So that's Jenny Cheshire from the 1980s. Here's another piece of research. This is done in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and this was the Milroys, and they studied the language of working class communities in Belfast in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. And they were particularly interested in what they call closed communities, so kind of tightly knit working class areas where there was actually high levels of unemployment. And they found that people who lived and worked in these so-called closed communities did tend to use more non-standard forms. And they did some interesting work looking at gender patterns as well. And they found that males who worked together, they tended to use more of these non-standard forms. But interestingly, there were these 2 Belfast communities, Hammer and Clonard, where there was actually very high male unemployment. And in these areas, the males were largely staying at home and looking after the children, whereas the females were going out working. And in these areas, the female language tended to be more vernacular, i.e. there were more non-standard features from the females than the males. Okay, so this shows the importance of kind of group membership and community on language and identity. So the study demonstrates the importance of social networks within a social class and their influence on the way that people use language in their speech communities. Okay, so I've talked about Peter Trudgill with his Norwich study. I've talked about Jenny Cheshire in the 1980s with her Reading study. And I've just talked there about the Milroys doing their work in Belfast. Okay, thank you very much.